Greetings all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer Podcast. I'm excited to bring today's guest, Dwayne Orrick, onto the show. We were just having a really good laugh before we hit record button, and maybe we'll come back and tell a few of those things that got us laughing. But even in retirement, sometimes, Dwayne, I'm afraid to say things that I know I probably shouldn't say out loud. But you got to have some fun. But welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I guess before we get rolling into this, we got a lot to talk about today, but maybe just give the audience a little bit of background about who you are. We know you're a retired chief of police, but you've gone on to do a lot of things even post your law enforcement career that I think our audience can benefit from. So have at it.
Well, I started in 1978 when I was literally a kid. And was a sheriff there that had a lot of vision. And when he got elected in 1973, he had a bachelor's degree, and that was just unheard of in law enforcement in places around the country. But he kind of, in so many ways, was a great mentor for me, and worked my schedule around so I could go to college. And most of that time it was part-time, except for in the summer times I'd be working full-time. And he encouraged me to go to work at the University of Georgia Police Department and work on my graduate degree. And so I went there for 3 years and went to work for the state. And during that time, there was a lot of jail litigation going on. And for about 4 years, I worked for the state as a criminal justice consultant. And basically, the agency was designed to actually work with local governments and address management type issues. And a good portion of that was establishing some jail standards and helping inspect jails and help them design the constructions, and as well as doing staffing analysis and organizational reviews. And then in 1990, I went to work for Cordell Police Department in South Georgia. It was a rural community, 13,000 people with a lot of challenges, and eventually became public safety director. And in 2011, I was there for 21 years. I went to work in Roswell, which is a completely opposite. It was North Metro Atlanta agency, a very large agency with a little over 200 officers, and for a couple of years. And then I went over to the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Office, which is the second largest county in Georgia. And I was a major over support services. Most of that was training. We had about 750 deputies, but I had state certification, evidence, all the training. We implemented a lot of kind of creative leadership development programs there. And for a short while, I went to work for the state, and I would never do that again. And a little over I'm working on 6 years now as an assistant director at the Georgia Police Chiefs Association. So,
well, state bureaucracies, sometimes can be difficult to navigate. They can be frustrating. So, Roswell, I think I mentioned this on our last time we chatted, but pretty nice community, Roswell. Yeah, mm-hmm. I went through advanced hostage rescue course at Blackwater with the team. Some of my back in my SWAT days with a group from Roswell, and back then, to this was the early 2000s, and I will say, one of the things I was really impressed with them is the investment that the agency made in their equipment, and of course, obviously, the training. At the time, that was one of the only facilities that I was aware of where you could go and do live fire training, and actually dynamic movements with live fire training. And I think part of the theme and the things that we talk about on the show are really how do we get closer to doing the real job in a training environment where we can really stress and pressure test people. And if you've never been in a live shoot house before with people you don't know, that'll raise the pucker factor.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a great experience. I digress. If you had to sum up right now what you think the state of law enforcement is, not just in Georgia, I know that's where you are, and that's probably what you're most familiar with. But yeah, what do you think, across the country? What do you think about the state of policing today?
I'm sure we'll come back to some of this later on, but I think we're in we're trying to grapple with some dynamic changes that's going on um, between different of where we have been and where we need to be going. And and you'll hear me talk about tribalism across the country and identifying issues with law enforcement. But so many times we're dealing with social structures and issues that people are looking for simple answers to complex problems. And I know, for instance, a number of years ago, um, all these things about decriminalizing activity. And Georgia, talking to the DOC commissioner a number of years ago, and he said the average person that goes to prison who's gone through 7 diversion efforts before they actually get sent to prison. And
Wow.
and what we're dealing with today is a breakdown. Every problem we have today is because of a decision or a group of decisions that's been made in the past. And you can't fix it, as Einstein said, by thinking at the same level. And we're going to have to start thinking of issues um, in whole new ways. And but the bottom line is the the least common denominator in our society is the family. And we have genetically designed to have families. And that's what makes us strong. But there have been social measures in our society that have helped to destroy the family. And by the time it gets to the schools, by the time it gets to um, the family and children social services, to the police, it's too late almost, because you're expecting these people to externally fix something that needs to be fixed internally. And when there's a void out there, kids are going to find it, and that's why you have issues with gangs today. And there's a lot of activities about, over the years I've heard a lot of examples about young people need to be shown how they're supposed to be acting, and nobody's doing that. And so, but I think we got some social structures that are changing across the country in different areas that some are good, some are not so good, um, and we've been through this before. It's pretty common about every 40 to 50 years to have huge changes, as generations revolve out. And the generation we focus with today is pretty much the same generation we had with the baby boomers back in the early 60s.
Yeah, and let's see, it's an opportunity, and sometimes it's hard to think of this time period as an opportunity, but you have to. I want to go back real quick. So you're talking about the conversation that you had with that jail commander. I want listeners to hear that statistic again. 7 diversion efforts before going to prison for the first time. And communities need to hear data points like this, information like this, because we're in this period of time where there is publicly the message is we need to display more empathy for the underprivileged and the people that haven't had the same opportunities maybe as others. And that, there's a lot to be learned from that. But 7 diversion efforts, and oftentimes the old story that gets told is like, oh, poor Johnny, he got caught selling weed, 2 joints, and now he's doing hard time. It's like maybe there are some very, very rare cases where things like that happen, but the likely explanation is Johnny may have gotten caught with 2 joints this time, but he's also had 7 prior conviction for selling pounds, if not hundreds of pounds, and now we're finally gonna do something that hopefully will change his behavior in the long term. But there's a myth, I think, out there that prisons are full of innocent people that need to be rescued.
Well, you made a good point too, that I think that we've been using this statement quite often, is talking about the data points. Statements without evidence are just opinions. And, you need to be able to back up that data, your opinions or how you feel with evidence. And we're not doing that. You hear so many people out there, well, I feel, and I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a college professor, and he'll tell them, I don't care how you feel in this class. I want you to justify your argument, whether it's to the left or to the right or whatever, with evidence. And I think that's a critical component that we need to be teaching people today. And may carry you places that you didn't anticipate when you do that.
Well, if you make a classroom a safe space where not even your thoughts can be challenged, then we're in big trouble. And that ties into one of the conversations that I wanted to have is we have a new generation of police officers that are hitting the streets. And, over the last decade or so, they come from a generation, quite frankly, that was raised by people like me in my generation. And we see differences in just, what their skill sets are, what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. What do you think about today's police officer compared to maybe the officer of 10, 20 years ago?
Yeah, we had this same thing. I remember years ago when I was starting, I was going to college, and this crusty old lieutenant said something in front of the sheriff about, I'd rather have a man with 4 years experience than 4 years of college. And I said, that's right. I understand, Lieutenant, but 4 years from now, I'm going to have both. And the sheriff said, well, what do you got to say about that? And so here's what we have today is different than what we've had before. Yeah, we're going to have some of those issues, but the people that we're looking for today are not the same ones we were looking for 10 or 15, 20 years ago. And this is important for several reasons. One, we're looking for people with critical thinking skills, with people with good judgment, problem solving, communication skills, both in written and oral. You may have an officer that's down in the projects talking to somebody that limited education, limited income, and an hour later they're talking to a suspect, then they're talking to a prosecutor, then they're talking to somebody at the hospital, a doctor, and then they're talking to a judge. And that takes a unique skill set to be able to move in those things. The point is, those people can get a job anywhere. And you're not competing with other police departments anymore or the military. You're competing with every potential employer out there. And elected officials, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, later on, have got to recognize that law enforcement is an investment, not an expense. But so often they're run by the accountants, and many city managers come up through the accounting department, and they view employees as an expense and not, in the HR perspective, as an investment. You can only be as good as the people you get. And so there's a number of other things I think that we're going to have to work on in the near future. But everything that this new generation, just like when we came through, we're bringing unique skill sets too. But we're not hiring the same people. And here's the other thing about this too, is our organizations are not learning organizations as you see in other parts of the country. For the most part, is we're getting people with all these skill sets and abilities and then trying to run them through the same structured formation that's still based on kind of a 1960s, 70s, and 80s mentality. And if we truly view our pupils as leaders, that is, they're out there influencing their environment without direct supervision, then they and everybody's a follower also, but they're leaders out there. And we got to teach them how to be leaders and how to do that in the desired way.
Yeah. And that's interesting because a lot there, we have this management structure in police departments. We are a paramilitary organization, and there is a critical need to be able to have that delineation of authority and decision-making responsibility. But any officer, the officer that's working the midnight shift, that's out on the road, he's essentially the chief, and until a supervisor arrives. And then the supervisor, he's essentially the chief once he gets there, and so on. And so that the responsibilities for decision making and what to do, when to do it, it does require a unique skill set and someone that is mentally flexible, that can communicate effectively, in a wide variety of circumstances. Do you think that we do a good job training that? Do you think our academies and our field training officer programs, do you think that maybe this is hard to make a blanket statement with, but I think just speaking in generalities, do you think that, as you mentioned before, right? Even Einstein recognized, right? You can't solve new problems with an old way of thinking. And do you think we need to rethink some of this?
Oh yeah, yeah. Or else we're not going to be able to retain those people and bring them into the organization or attract them to us. And another issue is we're going to have to change. Really go out there and tell our story. We're not doing a really good job of telling our story either, so that people will see it as a service, it's a sacrifice, it's a honor to be able to do what we do every day, and we're letting somebody else tell our story, and we're not doing that. But to go back to your question, no, any kind of change is going to be. We're slow to evolve, and there's some agencies that are getting out there in the front of it, but I don't want to be too critical, but there are some people in our profession that are just cognitively lazy. They want to do what they've always done. And 100 years ago, it took us 100 years to double the amount of human knowledge we had. 50 years ago was 50. Today, according to who you're talking about, it takes between 3 years and 3 months, according to what field you're in, the amount of human knowledge that we're developing through artificial intelligence and just the speed at which things are occurring. And I tell that to people is you don't need to worry about whatever your state mandated training is. You need to be constantly learning something, several things every day to just stay relevant. And so many people around the country today are going to quickly become irrelevant.
Yeah, Moore's law, it's a bitch, right? If you get behind the power curve, you might not ever catch up, right? You become irrelevant. And in a lot of ways, I think I have to agree with you that cognitively lazy is a good way to put it, right? And another way to put it is that we're really good at waiting for someone else to solve our problem. We sit, because it's a safe way to approach things, especially if you're an administrator. And and I have to defend chiefs a little bit here, right? Because you're in a kind of a interesting position. Most chiefs, if not all chiefs, are appointed. They're not elected. Sheriffs are elected. So sheriffs have a little bit more, they can be a little bit more free in what they do. Their decisions are their own, and they're accountable in election cycles. But chiefs are, accountable to somebody else, and that's typically a mayor, a city manager, maybe a city council, depending on the form of government. But one wrong decision and a chief's gone, right? Or it might be the right decision, but it might not be the decision that their boss wanted them to make. So they, what's a mayor do then? Bring in somebody else, and that doesn't necessarily create an environment where you have open thinking and out of the box thinking. It tends to push more groupthink. And a great example of this is in the state of Indiana, we have and I think every state has this. I'm going to get in a future podcast with a gentleman from Ohio. We're going to kind of have this discussion, but you have the similar experiences down in Georgia. In the state of Indiana, when you get appointed to a chief's position, there's a mandatory 40-hour course that you have to attend at the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy. And they only have 40 hours to try to teach you the things that they know that you need at the core level, right? You have to get the basic foundation. These are the things as chiefs you must do to meet the legal standards, to keep your agency, above board. But not every chief that comes into those into that classroom comes from the same place. Some are coming from a 3 or 4 officer department, and some are coming from 1,000, officer department. And yet, the responsibilities that they have are the same. And yet the public is going to judge both chiefs really in the same way, even though, one might come from an agency where they haven't been afforded the opportunity for continuous education, for professional development, for good mentoring, for, with good coaching. So that, it creates a challenge.
Yeah, a couple of things that you said right there, because we do a similar program here, and our association actually does that under state statute, and then they have to go through training every year that we approve or provide. And usually we provide in most of it. But and people are coming at it. Everybody's coming at it from different levels, as an individual and as collectively as a group. And but when you start talking about a police chief, if it's a 2-man department or a 2,000 person department, I didn't want to say 2-man, 2-person, because I'm a huge advocate for women in law enforcement.
Yeah, me too.
They're still responsible as the chief executive. They're the policy maker. They're responsible for the budget, the policy, holding people accountable and living. And if they don't do that, then their actions can reflect on every other police organization in the state or the country. And we know of an example here just recently up in the north central part of the United States where one officer's behavior impacted every agency in this nation and the perception of every agency because of one person's, actions. And today, what an officer or a chief does can be going out to literally millions of people in seconds, even before the officer, supervisor, or anybody else even knows it's being posted. And so we're in a whole new dynamic that we're still not really addressed with. The other thing I think that historically law enforcement has been pushed out there to be the catch-all for all the other organizational failures. All right. If you got a sick child, or you got a child molestation, and you need support services, or in most areas of the country you're having to dealing with a mental health consumer, mental health people close the door at 5 o'clock, and you can't find them until Monday morning about 9. Social services, they'll have one person on contact, and they're not going to show back up. And so I think that those organizations need to follow a public safety model and how they provide the services, where it's 24 hours and, they can do some studies about when they're doing it and stuff. But here's the thing. There is no public, private, or nonprofit organization that you can call, and within most areas of this country, 5 minutes or less, $250,000 worth of equipment and personnel will show up at your front door without.
A great way to put it. And I'll go back to, sometimes we're not good at telling our story, but that's one thing that we really should. So this brings up another good topic, and we kind of touched on it, but we're in this really interesting period where we don't have the number of recruits coming into the profession. I had a great conversation with Matt Dolan from the Dolan Consulting Group about this. They wrote a great article called "Weathering the Storm in Police Staffing," and you mentioned something that they talk about in that article is that we are competing not just against other police departments, but other industries. And not only are we competing against other industries, but we're also competing against a shrinking pool of potential candidates. So the number of people that are eligible to be officers, that population is declining. And now we're also more competitive with every other industry. So that creates really some big problems. And now you combine that with an environment where defunding has kind of gained this, I think in some circles, it's gained some credibility that it's actually a viable or a good strategy. So you wind up with police departments, just like you said, that can have a response to your door, depending on where you live, right? Anywhere between 2 and 10 minutes. If you call 911, someone's going to be there. And I think that's all in jeopardy now. And I think that's what people really need to understand, is that when you call 911, because of these other decisions that are being made, typically way outside the control of law enforcement, someone may not come. They may call you back and say, can you explain to me the nature of your emergency? Because we need to make a resource decision about whether we can even send somebody to this. Or they just, worse yet, they don't even answer. And a lot of major metropolitan areas and quite frankly, even smaller departments are already faced with that problem. They don't have the people. So if no one's coming to work, nobody's coming to your call for emergency support. So all that being said, what do you think about this time as an opportunity? Again, I'll come back to the word opportunity, for police departments to reassess what is our core function? What drives value for our community in our response? And if we can clearly identify that, if we can work with all the stakeholders in our community to understand what should the police be involved in and what should somebody else solve or work with, then we can realign, I think, what our roles and responsibilities are going to be. So maybe we're going through a process of being forced to right size our police departments.
A couple of things that bounce around in my head is, first of all, what is happening is you had these people that went out, had this great grandiose idea that said, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, without ever finding out what the problem was and what got us to where we are today. And we're just going to move people around without recognizing the whole issue about building structures, developing people, and addressing those issues. The lack of vision, basically, on so many people's part. Secondly, though, we talked about prior to coming online, is that public safety is an issue of economic and community development. Just like if people don't feel safe, they're not going to move their families and businesses to your community. And if they feel unsafe and they live there, they're going to opt out if they've got the resources to do that. It's just as important as roads, water, sewage, electricity, education, and internet. If people don't feel safe, and let's go back to Chicago, here we are in 2023, has lost 4 major corporation headquarters, moved out because their employees were being victimized and they didn't feel safe anymore and they were unresponsive to them. Then we have somebody in California who pushed the defund the police and now is upset because her citizens are calling saying the police are not available to come to my house or to come help me anymore because the police left. They don't have any officers, just to your point. They don't have officers out there. Now, I understand in some, varies by jurisdiction. But remember, the people that we're hiring, they can get a job anywhere. Okay. And they've got unique skill sets. They're honest, they're hardworking, critical thinking skills. They can solve problems, they can diffuse conflicts. And who doesn't want to hire one of those people?
Yeah. And there's a lot of incentives in this environment to go in a different direction for police officers. They're making those decisions because, one of my other passions is, besides, is the health and longevity of the officers that we do have, and again, the theme for this show, right? How do you hire healthy? How do you retire healthy? How do you optimize that time in between? But then also, how do you set somebody up so when they're done with their career, that they can have a long and healthy life afterwards. Right now, that just it's not there. The long-term health outcomes, the mortality rates, it's really poor. It's poor for a lot of shift workers and first responders, but it's really bad for police officers. And so with all that pressure, when you got an officer in that 3 to 5 year mark, just when your investment in them is starting to pay off and they make the decision, you know what, I've had enough. I've seen this. I think I'm concerned about where this future is going. Some of the work that we've done with performance protocol, we're doing these surveys before we go into departments, and we're doing surveys after they run through these coaching programs. And one thing that we hear all the time, you go to any state house, the argument is being made that we need to pay our officers more. And I don't disagree with that. I firmly agree with that. Not only pay, but there has to be additional benefits. But when you go to a police officer and you ask them, what are the things that are most important to you? Pay is not in the top 3. It's important to them, but the number one thing is my department going to invest in me? What plan do they have for me? What are my career development opportunities, and where do I fit into all of this? And so it's interesting. We do need to fight for better pay and better benefits. But maybe the opportunity is in a shrinking pool. Maybe we expand, some of that training and the investment that we make in the individual to optimize them to bring more value per person to their community, rather than just trying to throw bodies at a problem.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Let me go back 1 second, then I'll come back to what we're talking about now. Is all those issues that we talked about just a second ago about problems in the community, where it's going to have the most impact is on the economically challenged people in the communities, because they don't have as many options as others do. And that's the sad thing, because who is a society we're supposed to be helping and protect and defending. And those are the ones that so many officers that I worked with for the last 40 years had a passion for helping people, and doing that kind of stuff. And I think the people coming in law enforcement today, they sincerely want to make a difference and they want to help people. And I think that's part of our thing that you were talking about, is we need to sell that message, is we make a difference where nobody else does what we do every day. And how do we do that? We need to sell those positive stories. You brought in the whole issue is, I agree. Officers need to be paid for their skill sets, for the hours they work. Some of the things that, the stress, the suicide level, and what we don't hear about is the suicide level of retired officers. 2-3 years afterwards, some estimates are 3 times higher than what it is for the officers there, because of our work environment. They've isolated themselves and other things, and they don't have that support network with their family and friends and other stuff. And, when you leave the presence of the agency, you're in or out. Once you're out, you don't have that. People don't talk because they're caught up in what they have to do with every day. And again, it's because officers having to do so many different things that that there had to be the cure-all for everything. But you brought up the good point about developing those individuals. One agency I know are doing, everybody in the shift gets together and they debrief every day on one issue that happened. And it's this evolving with their organization, but the idea is to, what did we do good and what can we do different and better next time? And you locking in these kind of things, we're reaffirming, not that you did something bad, but you can do it better. Okay. And it's constantly learning and reevaluating. Oh, did you think about this? Did you think about this? And it doesn't take but like 3 to 5 minutes. And if they don't have a situation that happened that day, then they pose, well, what would you have done if this would have happened? Again, reaffirming what you did good and how you can do better. Not that you did something bad, but the other issue that we had talked about, there was one department here in Georgia, 200 plus officers in a department, that they developed a coaching. They started employing the use of professional coaches who work with Delta Airlines, Home Depot, all the Fortune 500 companies. And they initially started with command staff, and now they've gone all the way down to sergeants, where they do testing and groups, and it becomes more specialized and focused on the individual the higher they go in the organization. In the past 12 months, they've not lost a single officer in a 200 plus department. And they attribute it to their first line supervisors. In 2 years, they've not had an appeal of a discipline action. And here's what the chief says that they're saying when they come to the hearing. They said, you know what? I did what they said. I was trained better than that. I didn't follow the policy on this. You will never see this. I want to first apologize to my supervisor that I put him in this situation, and you won't ever see this conduct out of me again, because they have that relationship with that supervisor that they know they put that supervisor in that situation. And so, and I'm sure we're going to come around to this eventually, but we worked with the University of Georgia and our post council and our association, and they've not published the results yet, but they did a study over 20 years with over 220 something thousand officers. And they found out that most officers leave in the first 3 years, about 50%. And it seems as though the numbers are higher for females than males. And of course, a lot of things have changed in gender roles in the last 20 years. But it seems as though white candidates are more likely to leave than African-American candidates are. But perhaps we need to kind of look at that whole, if we do the coaching and possibly, what do we do investing in those first 3 years and then afterwards? Another thing I think we're going to be able to do is what technology is going to be able to do with us in the near future too, with the issue of speed enforcement cameras. I mean, in our state, if you do that in other areas, they're limited to school zones, but I know other states, they do speed enforcement. You can't call racial profiling because they're reading the tag number. It's a civil violation, so it doesn't go against your insurance. It has a limited fine that's smaller, and you don't have an officer out there working traffic and doing the stuff. They can be focused on more where human resources are actually needed. So much of the automated reporting systems, but people still want that in-person kind of activities. The other action is one of our major counties started a real-time crime center, and they give the illustration that they get a call of a shooting that just occurred, and it was a Toyota Camry, and so they pull up their cameras and look at their network, and while the officer's on the way, they can identify it is a white Camry. Here's the tag number, is registered to this person with a picture of him. He's a black male, because they didn't know anything about who the suspect was. He's a black male with a red hat and a blue jacket. So when they're going down the road, they're looking for a white Camry with somebody wearing a red hat and a blue jacket with his tag number before he even got on the scene. And that technology in the future is kind of big brother, and I think we need to make sure that we have those safeguards in place, that we're not invading people's privacy. But those are the kinds of things we're going to help us work smarter, not harder.
Yeah, and so a lot of things to go back there. And I love the fact that you're working with the University of Georgia to do these studies, because you mentioned it earlier. One of the things that we need more than anything is good data. You have to, if you're going to make an argument, you got to be able to make it with good information. I don't know any other way to explain it. And we have to stop making emotional arguments. Hey, how was your day? It was busy. Oh, what'd you do? Oh, I was just busy. I was busy all day. I was busy being busy. And we all hear that, right? And I think it's easy for all of us to kind of, it's an icebreaker type of conversation, but it can also be a mindset that this is what we're doing. And so in the state of Indiana right now at the State House, they're having these conversations about even to run a pilot program for speed cameras in construction zones. They've shot it down at the State House multiple times over the years, having red light cameras, automated traffic cameras. And it's really interesting to think about this process, right? I mean, people do want to protect their privacy and their safety, but what we ultimately know, and again, this is my opinion for whatever it's worth, is that the reason we don't want to do that is because we know we run red lights, and I don't want to get the damn ticket. So,
Well,
and people are going to
here's the
complain to
thing.
me if we do it. So, but we also know that running red lights is the one of the things that causes the most crashes, that drives insurance rates up, that gets people injured, that creates hospital bills. So it's like we have this really, really simple solution, but yet no, don't use that.
Exactly. And you know how do you avoid that? Don't run the red light. Don't go through the school zone speed. All right. And so
Well,
they say that.
Waze will tell you. Waze right now, people will program in where the speed cameras are, so right. So if
Yeah.
that's crowdsourcing good information, good data. So and in the end, what does that do for everybody? It makes us all safer. It slows us down. It's humorous in a way. It's frustrating in a way. But the other thing about that is if like in the state of Indiana, we're having the same issues as everybody else is, right? We're having a hard time recruiting across, state agencies, local agencies. Now, some of the wealthier communities, like the ring communities in Marion County, probably very similar to what you experienced down there in Atlanta. Some of the communities where all of your wealth goes, where those people live, they've got the resources to be able to pay more, to provide better benefits. And so if you're an officer that's working in an economically stressed area, that's also where all the calls for service are going to be. The calls for service are not going to be in the suburbs. It's not to say that you don't have some calls for service there, but they're generally not going to be related to violent crime, maybe some property crime or maybe medical issues, things like that. But it's not going to be, your part one crimes. And so if you're an officer that's in a department where you're understaffed, you're overworked, you're getting forced to work mandatory overtime, you don't get any time off, no rest, no recovery, and yet every night you're going out and you're being asked to go work in the busiest, most dangerous parts of your environment. Now, that's fun for a while, but then there comes to a point where it's just like, man, I'm looking just one county over, and I see they're getting paid $30,000 more a year. Their pensions are better. Their medical benefits are better. The risk that they are taking are nowhere near what I'm taking. You know what? I've had enough. I've done my share here, and I'm moving on. And I think
You hit
that's
the
the
nail on
problem.
the head. That was the core deal for me. And it was a small community. It was a major indicator on everything. And the level of crime was, amongst some of the worst in the state per capita. And we changed a lot of things over there, and we did a lot of differences and stuff. But when people are stacking calls, even for a small department, and then they can see at the neighboring agency that they can literally go just a few miles down the road, and I can answer one call maybe a day. The rest of the time, I got all this free time, and I can make $5,000 a year more. There's another agency in South Georgia where the officers, like I said, is stacking calls, and then he can go literally to the agency that butts up to their community city limits and answer a call once a day, maybe two calls a day, and the rest of the time they're just riding around out in the countryside, And so,
That's the truth. And you know what? And it's funny to watch people try to dress that up as something, anything but what it really is at its core. I don't know. I don't, I say all this not knowing, what the solution is, except investment. It's the only way you're going to solve this problem. And I'm not saying you have to throw money needlessly at a problem, but you throw it, if you do it very intentionally, then I think you can eliminate some of these incentives or these disincentives that we create. Because right now it's just, and I predicted it back in 2015, right? It's the cannibalization. It's been going on now. I just, right before we got on here, I saw an article on LinkedIn they were discussing the state of Washington has the state of Washington has invested $10 million to hire up to 56 prosecutors to work nothing but police misconduct cases. And I was just like, oh my gosh, we're going to spend $10 million to do that, but we won't spend $10 million to hire more police officers or train the ones that we have better or equip them better. What we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to throw money at something that is, quite frankly, it's going to make us feel better and we'll be able to go out and tell people from an elected official position that we're doing something to solve the problem without any understanding of what the core issues are.
Yeah, I want to hit, and I know some of your listeners will not like this, okay? Because Georgia's a right to work state. Here's what the statistics are. Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina post-council revoke more certifications than the rest of the states combined. And it's not because we got bad officers, it's because we got mandatory reporting requirements by the officer and the department when somebody does something that fits within their categories, okay? But until just a few years ago, there were still 5 or 6 states that had no post council. One state, they've got a post council, but they hadn't funded it. Another one, they don't have, and I don't want to call any state out because that's, you got great officers in every department, but you have these, they have a post council, but they can't revoke the certification for the officer. The agency has to request for it in some states. And so we got a call from one state and they were asking, well, we understand that you have to do this. And I said, yeah. And I went through and said, we have to report it within so many days of the incident occurring of say an officer got arrested for DUI, or if he got terminated or resigned in lieu of termination, has to be notified a post council, and they'll come and investigate it. And then they'll make a report back. And he said, and he made a comment about the unions wasn't supporting it. And I said, well, it's not the union certification. The state gives the certification. The state can take it away. So, but those are behaviors that the agency can handle it. And many times the post in Georgia won't come and do anything with it. But what we're seeing is those officers, the gypsy officers going around. The other thing, though, is there was a study done about 4 years ago of unions and I'm trying to think exact number. It was several hundred union contracts they looked at. And what they found was they had a range of 1 to 7 appeals with a median of 3 levels of appeal. And of those, they still could go to an administrative judge and put the person back to work, even though everybody found that the person was guilty of what they said and wanted to decertify them, put them back to work. Okay. And we have that kind of stuff with post counsel in Georgia. They can go to a judge and the judge can overrule the state. And that happens. Okay. But what we're finding, though, is the unions do a lot of great stuff. All right. And they got great benefits and great salaries in the North that we don't enjoy in the South. Yep. But they're also defending officers that they shouldn't be defending. And that's affecting all the great officers in that department that are doing everything perfect every day, or, doing everything well. And it's not doing any benefits for the agency and the citizens they serve either. And so, we got to hold people accountable. But the other thing comes back to your supervisors. Why are they not fixing that before it became a problem?
Well, yeah, we'll get to that. I want to go back real quick. So what you're describing, and I've talked about it before, is what we call the fundamental attribution error. We blame individuals for a system problem. Mm-hmm. And instead of trying to fix the system, we do the easy thing and blame the individual. And we hold individuals accountable, and we try to make individuals the example. And so, that's what creates this interesting human dynamic, I think, between unions and management. Indiana is a right to work state also. so it was always interesting to me, like when I was attending staff and command at Northwestern, talking with Illinois officers and Illinois, administrators, where just the union issues and the things that they have to negotiate. And I think in the end, what any system really needs to do is just what you said. If you hold the individuals accountable to what the standard is, then you don't have to get into these big legal battles, because you're going to prevent most of the big problems from occurring. I mean, that's just a fact, right? It doesn't matter. It's like if you don't discipline your kids when they're young, how can you expect them to discipline themselves when they're older?
Well, and here's the thing: the unions came out of the guild programs where they taught people to become, craftsmen over the years, and that's what the unions have evolved into. And the unions need to be partnering with agencies to protect their members against those members who don't want to do it, and that mentality, that attitude of entitlement too, that they can do whatever they want to whoever they want. In the long run, it's just best for everybody. And so, when I was talking to this one state, I was telling them, "Oh, it gets even better. All of our emails in Georgia are open records. All of your cell phone calls, your cell log is open records, and personnel files are open records except for medical stuff. So once they handle that disciplinary issue, anybody can come and ask for a copy of that." And this guy asked me, "Well, how do y'all do with that?" He said, "Well, for the most part, we try not to do stupid stuff."
Oh, yeah, I love it. Well, that's easier said than done, right? Now, and I will say this too, right? Because if you do that, right, and this goes back to frontline supervision, and you made that. I think you made this. I think to some of those data points from earlier, right? Depending on the state that you're in, you're looking at, and we did some of this work with performance protocol as well, with an ROI calculator. But if you're investing anywhere from 160,000 to 250,000 in that first 1 to 3 years in hiring, training, and equipping an officer, doesn't it seem like it makes sense financially to then continue to make as much of an investment as you can to progress their development from there? Not just stop there, but that's where, that's just your initial investment, and that's where it begins. It's like, I don't know, it's like buying $100,000 car, knowing that when you drive it off the lot, it's worth $80,000, and then you drive it for 3 years and it's worth, I don't know, 50,000, 40,000, and then you go buy another $100,000 car. You just like, I'm done with that one. I'll go buy another one, right? You're never going to get if you don't take care of it, you're not going to get the value out of it. If we don't train our people, we're not going to get the value. So if you're losing, like that Georgia study you mentioned, if you're losing 50% in the first 3 to 5 years, then you've got to go back and make that spend over again. And this is where we got to tell our story better, especially making these cases for the people that control the budgets, whether it's counselors, whoever, to make that spend for the continued investment, because it's saving money in the long term. No private business would ever operate like that. They couldn't afford to operate like that. They would lose their money. That's why like you were talking about, the company, the department that's modeling what the private sector is doing in hiring the coaches to bring back to their officers, that's an investment in the people, right? Because their people are the ones that are going to bring the return in the end. Yeah,
so
your best people.
Let me give you this example that we've talked about before, but so many elected officials have a scarcity mentality. We got to, and they define what they find important is by what they fund with the taxpayers' dollars. Okay.
Yep.
And when they get pushed that their community is not safe, they're suddenly trying to pour more money into it now because, oh my goodness, we need to do this. And that's good that they're seeing this. But let me go back on constantly invest in your people, like you're talking about. is as first line supervisor is the hardest job in the department. And what do you do to prepare those people before they get into that position? And I know there's an evolving thing of kind of like a supervisor training officer, like you go with a supervisor, and some of the most progressive, and I'm not talking about politically progressive, I'm talking about professionally progressive agencies are doing that. They're not allowed to supervise anybody until they go through this program where they do check off just like they do in FTO. But the number one reason people leave in the departments, their immediate supervisor. You think, and all the people out there listening to us can say, what's the worst experience you ever had? They will always go back. Is this supervisor right here, and he did this, and he made my life miserable, and we'll probably say some words that we can't say on this podcast. But so you got a $250,000 investment in this officer, 3 years on the job. Supervisor runs him off. Give me an example. What would you do? You know, patrol car costs $50,000. What would you do with an officer who crashed and totaled 5 police cars in 1 year?
They wouldn't make it to 5 in my department. I can tell you that.
Well, so let's say he runs 3 people off. You know, that's 15 cars he crashed, right? Yeah. And so suddenly that's a $250,000 to $750,000 expense. And we got to start thinking as our people are an investment. They're not an expense. You know, that's what we talked about at the very beginning in there. And you got to constantly evolving and showing them that they're important to them.
Yeah, and you know, this is it's really interesting because in post retirement, I've had the opportunity to travel around the state and around the country. I get to have conversations like this on the podcast, and that's one thing for sure that I see in a lot of places. That how do we promote a frontline supervisor? Well, it's someone that's technically proficient and tactically sound, and they're a good test taker, and they're a really good interviewer. So they might be really good at their job, but now we're going to put them in a role where we're making them responsible for others, and with no way of screening or knowing whether they're going to be effective in that or not. And and then worse, we put them in those jobs and we don't train them. Literally no training, none whatsoever. One day you're an officer, the next day you're a sergeant. Well, and so how are you going to be a sergeant? Well, I'm going to model the behavior that I've seen before me. If you had a good sergeant, there's a chance that you're probably going to become a pretty decent sergeant. But if you've worked for some, less than stellar supervisors, and this is stuff that I see and hear all across the country. This is so again, and this is where investment is incredibly important. That's where defunding is the exact opposite wrong thing to do, because what are the things that you're going to cut, right?
Yep.
You're going to cut programs that aren't providing an immediate return. Investing in supervision, while it can provide an immediate return, it's a long-term process, and it's continual. It's not a one-time thing. It's something that you've got to do all the time.
I have not read the article, but this past week, and here we are, March of 2023. There was an Atlantic article that came out just this week, and I just saw a summary of it. But basically, it says American police are an investment that we make is much less. They talk about defund the police is much less than other parts of the world, and actually that number has gone down in the last few years also.
Yeah. In what other universe does it make sense if you want to improve something that you spend less on it?
Yeah.
So that's the Pete Blaber rule, right? He's got this. I'm very fortunate to see him speak, and I mentioned this one other time, but he's a former Delta Force commander, but he wrote a book called The Men, the Mission to Me. He's written several books to follow up on it, but when I saw him speak in person, he was talking about he's got the say it out loud rule. It was something that he worked on over his career. He's like, if I was thinking about something I was going to say, whether it might be controversial or maybe it's something I shouldn't say, I need to say it out loud so I hear myself say it first, And then if it sounds really bad to myself, I probably shouldn't say it to somebody else. So this is what I wish this people in the state house would do when they're talking about, or any city council or anyone that's thinking about defunding the police, is like, I want to improve policing. I want policing to be better and more professional. So what I'm going to do is spend less money on it. I'm going to take away resources from them. Oh,
but it's a culture, and I've talked to several police chiefs that came in with change agents, and you got to have support from your organization, from your appointed and elected officials to change that organization. You got to partner together, show what it's going to look like, but recognize it doesn't happen overnight. Several chiefs who made significant change said it took them close to 10 years to turn their organization around.
Absolutely. It does. It takes a long time. And, and it might not even necessarily be changing things around. In some cases, it's just trying to keep up, trying to keep pace.
Yeah.
And it's just trying to develop. It's not, and I say, for people listening, I say all this stuff, in full discovery here. Like, I've made all of these mistakes. I almost all of them. I mean, at one point or another, and then you come to realize it's like, well, you've learned the hard way here. It's like, well, how do we not do this again? Like, how do I not stick my hand on the hot stove one more time? Let's prevent that.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. And I was watching Star Wars last night, and Yoda says most learning comes from failure. You're going to fail. You're going to make mistakes, and acknowledge them, be open with them, and say, what can I do different? But what can we do about teaching those failures and learning those in development opportunities and development activities? That didn't work out like I thought it would. Yeah. I screwed the pooch on that one.
Seemed like a good idea in the moment. In hindsight,
it seemed like the thing to do. Yeah.
Well,
and I had done some really stupid stuff over the years too. So,
well, I got into a great conversation on a recent podcast with Andy Reese. Andy is he's a mental skills coach, a mental toughness coach, and he's a West Point grad, played football at West Point, and he has worked with special operations, and the military has made a lot of these same mistakes. So a lot of lessons. There's been a big investment in this type of change in culture, change in mindset, and again, that's one of the things that in speaking with leaders like you and with Andy and others, what I'm not saying I have all the answers, but what I am trying to do is share things that are working and open up people to the ideas and possibilities of what we can do, like to be better, to improve. And it was a great conversation with him. And he's got a book out. It's called Deliberate Discomfort, and a lot of great stories in there. But he was a co-author and senior editor for the book. And the way they structured the book is they use case examples of office, not just officers, but also soldiers in combat, their experiences, and they really, really just, got down to the real core raw emotions about what they did well, what they didn't do well. And when you were talking a few minutes ago about the department that's doing these debriefs at the end of the shift, it really made me think about that book. And I love that concept. And we do that in a SWAT environment, right? We've been doing that in tactical operations for years, having AARs, or at least I think most people probably are, like where you sit down, like in a room, like where there is no rank, there is no, that the hierarchy disappears in those critical moments where you have to say, this is what I did well, this is what I did not do well, this is what we need to improve on. And it's all about you, the individual, what you take ownership for, and other people have the opportunity to challenge you. Oftentimes people take ownership for things that they shouldn't. And others will correct them. That's not your responsibility. That's Joe's, that's Bob's. And then Bob has to be the one that says, yep, that was my responsibility. And the problem with when you're running short and you don't have enough staffing is, and it seems like a small thing, but it's a big thing when you can't, there is no after shift debrief. There is no one shift coming off and having an opportunity to speak to the oncoming shift about this is, hey, this is what's happening today. This is what was going on. And then really their own, so this is where technology can help us, but at the same time, it can also hurt us, because guess what? We need to get the coverage out there. We need, I don't want, 6 officers from the last shift, spending, having to spend an hour of overtime to come in and do a debrief, because that's an hour they're not going to get back of their own time. It costs the department money, but that's an hour of recovery that they're going to miss out, and they've got to be back here to work in 11 hours because we're working 12-hour shifts. So we're cutting into their recovery time. So, there's a trade-off for every decision that you make. So a real busy metropolitan police department or a smaller department that runs high calls for service, they might not be able to do that, and they're going to miss out, and they're going to miss a learning opportunity as an organization.
Well, it's the whole concept of being a learning organization too.
Yep.
Yeah. I got this saying sometimes about, all these problems, when it really, you feel bad, you just say, this too shall pass. Yeah. It might pass like a kidney stone, but it's going to pass. Okay.
I'm knocking on wood. I've had friends that have had that. I have not had to experience that, and I hope I never do.
Yeah, but those are the learning opportunities that and sometimes you talk over with other people. It's like, this is what I want to do, and some of the the proposals that I was bouncing around in my head as a young police chief, I was talking to a veteran chief, and he said it's little statements that you remember 20, 30 years later that people say that may inflection points on you. And he said, you may want to think about that. I said, all right. He said, this other agency did something similar like that, and we end up having to send a half a shift of officers over there to help them with that. All right. And so I was like, maybe you got a point there. I didn't think of that. And so you're having people you can bounce stuff off of, but how did we do that the other day? What we can do better? And
yeah, and that's another, and that's the danger. And I had this conversation with Andy and a few others, right? That's the danger when you have at 20 years or whatever the minimum retirement age is, when people hit that point and they're gone, right? Like first opportunity, they're gone, they're moving. Guess what? All those years of wisdom, the investment and the training and the time, it goes with them, and it's not being replaced. So now in this environment, what we have is we're younger officers are leaving, older, more experienced officers are retiring. So we're creating these gaps, and now we no longer have that same level of wisdom inside the organization. So we're bound to make mistakes that we might not otherwise have made. So yeah, it's there's opportunities again there. If you're making the right investments and you're getting people to the training, and just there's so many things that I think that we can be doing, that we should be doing, but we just have to have the courage to walk the plank a little bit, quite frankly.
Well, I think we can take a lot of guidance from other professions, and I'm going to use the sports industry for this too. I don't know if you've heard the concept of deliberate practice, and how you chunk information and you focus on one thing. And we've got an article coming out where we talk to the recent he's 12-time grand champion of national police competitions, and how he used the deliberate practice and other ways to cost effectively do firearms training. And we don't have to go fire 30 rounds. And he says it takes 10 years to become a great shooter. And most great shooters became great shooters because of dry fire training. And there's so many ways you can do that at no cost. But those concepts that Malcolm Gladwell made, that you got to do something 10,000 times to master it, he really was talking about something that was really started about 30, 40 years ago. But there's a number of books out there like Going Pro, Practice Perfect, the Talent Code about using that on everything from de-escalation to firearms to, defensive tactics to actually writing reports, and everything is just constantly focused on how do you develop that and how you can make it better and stuff. And so we're not doing that. We just do the baseline and that's it.
Yeah, we train to a minimum basic level of competency, and then now you're on your own, right?
Yep. And qualification scores, he made this point. I don't know if we put it in there. Qualifications is not training, it's testing.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing. We need to be focusing on continually training and evolving and developing those skill sets and pushing yourself just a little bit on what makes you uncomfortable. And let me telling a group of peers until you get used to doing this, that I really didn't pull my share of the load, or I failed on this, or this was not the thing I should have been doing. It takes a lot of maturity to go through those kinds of things to learn those. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information out there. Charles Duhigg's done a lot of good work in that space. Angela Duckworth, there's and when you study this and it makes sense, and then you bring it back, and the first person that I ever heard this the deliberate practice, really, it came from Cal Ripken Sr., who coached both his boys, right? Cal Ripken and Billy Ripken, and that's they had the term that practice does not make perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect practice makes perfect.
Exactly.
And it kind of ties right into that. So, repetitions don't really mean much if they're not good reps, because if you have and that's where dry fire and other techniques like that can come in, right? If you have poor technique and you practice poor technique, all you're doing is reinforcing, bad mechanics.
Trainers, you like the term muscle memory, but it's not muscle memory. It's actually the myelin, which is the insulator of the nerve endings from the brain to the hands and other things. It's just like a baby learning how to walk or to grab food or pick up a fork. Those are learned skills. And it's the same thing. Every time you do something, you're reinforcing that insulation, which makes that signal stronger. And if you're doing what you were just describing, just practicing without focused attention, you're reinforcing poor behavior or poor performance. And it's a biomedical, it's a biological issue that you're developing.
And you know what? It's across everything that you do. And I'll give you another example, because this kind of, I think, goes back to the core of what we're trying to get people to understand. It's better to invest early than to invest late. Invest early because now you get to leverage that early learning. It becomes a force multiplier. So if you want to go back to Moore's law again, right? If you've got a problem early on and you don't fix it, that's poor fundamentals, poor mechanics, poor learning, poor grasping of policy, all of those things. Now, you can't expect things to get better over time. And the example I'll give you, and this is, again, it's a perfect example where I started CrossFit after one of my SWAT guys, one of the new guys to our team, just wiped my ass in our fitness testing that we do biannually. And so I was asking him what he did and how he trained. And short version of a long story is, he introduced me to CrossFit. I started doing it. But there's some things in CrossFit where, they've got a saying, right? Mechanics, consistency, intensity, right? You have to have solid mechanics, right? Before you start. And then you have to be very consistent with your mechanics before you really can start ramping up intensity. Well, I'd been a gym guy for years where it was chest and tries, back and buys, run every once in a while, occasionally do legs. But, like a lot of people in that generation era, very tight shoulders. And so CrossFit requires really good mobility. If you want to be good at, this broad spectrum of things and be functional, you got to have the good mobility in your shoulders. You have to be able to move efficiently and effectively, and you have to be able to get into the right positions. And well, my mobility was absolutely horrible. So there were certain things that I just sucked at. And so what did I do? When you suck at something, what do? You avoid it. Like, well, I'm not going to do that movement, and then as I started moving in and doing like age group competitions and stuff, it's just like, yeah, I'm just getting because it's inevitable. The thing that you avoid is the thing that you're going to need the most coming up. So it's just one of these life lessons that just comes back to you. And, in the end, I spent the first 3-4 years avoiding shoulder, doing the slow, painful work of shoulder mobility and stretching and yoga and stuff like that to improve. And it cost me, it's like, if I could go back and do it over again, I would have started that from day one. But I say that, just a long way of saying we do the same thing in policing. Mm-hmm. We get off to a really good start. We get into an FTO program. We go to the academy, and then kick them out the door, and no plan for long-term investment across the board about how we're going to develop. And to defend agencies in this, the reason is look at training budgets for police mm-hmm. departments. They're just not there. And it's, you can't make it up, right? You can't pay, you can't pay for training with monopoly money. And that'll lead me to my last point here on this topic, is that this is where, again, in police departments, we are forced to always try to do more with less. And so what does that tend to make us do is not invest, not going directly to the source. We get watered down versions of training, and we get watered down results a lot of times.
But, one of the things I'd like to add to what you're saying, though, is there are ways to cost effectively perform some activities. And a friend of mine is the chief for 30 years almost, and got one of the best agencies in the country. When they're going through FTO, they do roll call training, but as the recruits are going through, as they're going through sections on high liability issues like pursuit, use of force, and in the other areas, they have to go and do a presentation before the shift. And he would talk about, how most cops are in the roll call training, they fall asleep, heads on the wall. And he said, but when the recruits get up there, they're sitting there listening to them, and they're asking questions. What would you do here? Or what about this? And they're not doing it to hammer them. They're trying to make sure that their future partner is going to be reporting to them, has a good understanding of what's expected of them. And they're kind of reinforcing that. And so, but they have to demonstrate they know that policy in front of their peers. And so another thing is if when you go to training, if you don't do something with that within 3 days of returning, your likelihood to do that or something drops off tremendously in the first 72 hours. If I was a chief today, one of the things I would do is every time somebody goes to a training class, they would have to come back and give a summary of the class they went to, what they learned, what they think they need to do differently, and how they can apply that stuff. That starts anchoring that behavior, and they give it to the supervisor and let it go up according to the size of the agency to wherever they feel it's appropriate. And maybe they can. Some of the best ideas have been simple comments that people have made over my career. Is like, wow, that's a great idea. And it's just one statement sometimes. And so, but how are they going to use this? And if they can't articulate how they're going to use it, then why did we send them through the training? And so, but okay, so how are we going to do this week? And challenge them to do that. Again, building that use of that knowledge. And hey, I'm expected to go to this training and do something other than get credits.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love that concept. I love it. And it's interesting too, and this is where technology is going to be, I think, interesting coming down the pipe. Virtual reality training, immersion training, augmented reality. That those are those opportunities there allow you to create repetitions in a near real-time environment, and seeing, based on real world information, real world data, that you just can't replicate in a training environment. And an example of this, and this, I give Axon a lot of credit for a lot of the development that they're doing. I was fortunate to partner with them on a lot of this stuff. But you think about how, a body camera is a body camera, but it's also an exponential learning tool in my mind, because it's really for the first time in the history of policing, it's giving us a front row seat to what the officer is seeing. As a supervisor, you can observe an officer's performance by going on a call with them. If it was a traffic stop, you could see it in a dash cam, in years past, but the body cam now goes with the officer. So now you can really start to evaluate call response and call performance, and evaluate the effectiveness of your organization based, and you can see things real clearly, like what training deficiencies, individual officer deficiencies, organizational deficiencies, and conversely, things that you're doing really well that you can build on. So yeah, it's really cool.
You're hitting the nail on the head on another thing here too. Is we collect all this data on pursuits and the traffic stops, and I'll give you a couple of things that is when you do the pursuit review. I mean, most people, a lot of agencies, they just write a report if they write a report on the pursuit. But go look at all the videos of all the officers involved in the pursuit. Did they follow it? Do a debriefing on it, and then go look at everybody that was not actually in the pursuit and what were they doing? Okay,
Yeah.
and they were going 120 miles an hour in a residential district trying to get over to the pursuit. And with computers and video cameras and things you can do nowadays, you can capture that. An example of this, I had an officer one time. It was a 25 mile an hour district that had a 90-degree curve in it, and he did not make the curve. He was not involved in the pursuit. He's going like 70 something miles an hour, blew out 2 tires, and great officer. But I learned something from that, is to what else is everybody else doing, so that we know that, and they know that we're going to be checking that for their safety. One of the biggest threats to police officers today are vehicle operation and getting hit by a car. Yep. And we're not focused on that. The other thing, I'll give you an example. We had a new recruit. We had an extensive training. We went through the academy, went through 12 weeks and 16 weeks in field training. And we had the sergeants pulling up the cameras, and he was this new guy here, and he was a great sergeant. I mean, he's a great guy. Been around for a long, long time, engaged with these people. And people loved working for him. And he said, came up and he said, well, I didn't want to start doing those reviews. He said, but you're not going to believe what I saw. And he had a recruit, the guy just got out of field training, major divided 4-lane road, makes a traffic stop, gets out, gets the driver's license, starts talking to him, and then calls in the traffic stop.
Yep.
A couple weeks out of training. And so I said, all right, so what did you do? And he said, well, I called him in and I showed him the video, and I asked him, is this how you did it in training at the academy? He said, no, sir. Is this how you did it in field training? He said, no, sir. Yeah, what makes you think it's okay to do that? And I shouldn't have done it. Yeah. And so what he did was positive discipline. He said, I tell you what, our off days are going to be different. He said, but next Tuesday when you come to work, you better have a 1,500 word essay that gives me as to what you did, why it was inappropriate, and how you're going to address this in the future.
Did he ask Is this something that I need to prepare while I'm on duty getting paid, or am I going to get paid overtime for doing
No,
it?
I think he was still on probation. He just got out of field training. He was so happy he wasn't getting something else, I think. But that officer will never forget that. And he'll never make that mistake again. And because, yeah, he could have hammered him, but it's a learning opportunity. And
it sets the tone for that shift and for that supervisor and for that officer about what the expectations are going to be. In that it's just as important to do what I know I need to do when nobody's watching as when I do it if I know somebody's watching. And there is I think most people outside of policing don't realize that officers really wanted the body cameras. Very few officers did not want body cameras. I mean, there were some that thought it was too intrusive and didn't like it, but for the most part, everybody knew that it was going to be a tool that could protect them. But for us, I mean, from day one, we did a lot of those same things, like mandatory random audits for supervisors. Go through and find things that we can. What I called them is, go find things that we can learn from, learning opportunities, and then go find things that we can teach others about how we're doing well.
Yeah,
and
great
discussions.
You hit the nail on the head in a couple of times in officers over the years. Back when we would put cameras in the cars initially, you had that mentality, typical cop, oh, they're going to use it against me. They're going to use it to punish me. And I was like, look, guys, I'm assuming because we've hired you and went through this extensive selection process and training and all this other stuff, that you're doing what's right and it's expected. Are you going to make mistakes? Yeah. Are you intentionally doing stuff wrong? I think the most part, most of you guys aren't doing that. And what they found out very quickly was it used to show that they were doing things right when complaints came in on them.
Yep.
So we had on our tasers, when we went to tasers, we had them on cameras on them. And before the body cameras came out, and we had this lady call and complain about an officer, said he used profanity. And I knew the officer, and she was a pastor. And I was like thinking to myself, well, that doesn't sound like him. And so I went and looked at the video, and I called her back, and I said, I'd like for you to come down. I want you to look at this video because the officer was down in the projects when he confronted your son. And she said, oh, let's stop a second. You said what did you say? That's not my son. I said, no, ma'am, it's your son. Because then he chased him for 3 blocks into that other apartment complex where he said he was stopped. Okay. And she said, my son was in the projects. And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, come on down, look at this. She said, no, that's all I needed to know because he wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to have been down at the fairgrounds, which is 2 blocks from there. And I said, well, please come and welcome. But that was the kind of thing there. It's
yep.
From the very beginning, it comes up to show officers doing the right thing most of the time. So,
yeah. And it's, oh man, this is like we could have a whole, another hour conversation just on this alone, but we're getting up at 90 minutes already. I knew this was I told you it would go fast.
Yeah.
And a lot of great conversation. I really appreciate it. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you want to touch on before we wrap this up?
No, I just really encourage people to start looking at some of this diversity, critical thinking, and start employing some of these techniques out there. We have got to start thinking in different ways and questioning what we do and how we can do it better. And I think the young officers, they want to do this, and it's going to have to change our perfection and actually engage the community in some of this stuff too. The overwhelming majority of the public support and want to work with the police and work with your minority leaders, work with your churches to make those not community relations, but community engagement where people are working together to solve problems. That's where you get the support of the people. Because if you don't have the support, it's a budgetary issue. Poor image, poor support, good image, good support. You get the people behind you and you'll get what you need.
Amen.
Because that's who the politicians are looking for. They want to get reelected.
So, a couple of questions I like to ask to wrap this up. What's your favorite book? Do you have could I say, do you have one favorite book? And I do generally tell people excluding the Bible.
No, I'm going to tell you, I'm reading 3 to 4 books at any one time. And my wife, she complains about me Amazoning all the time. And I'm a sweetheart, with all the bad things I could be doing. I know me buying books and reading just terrible. I'm going to try to do better. But
I'm going to start buying bourbon instead of books.
Yeah. And so we I tend to lean towards nonfiction. And in the last few years, I've been looking at the books I named out earlier regarding the deliberate practice and critical thinking and stuff. I'm in traffic every day for 3.5 hours, driving across Atlanta on the north end of the perimeter and stuff. So I listen to a lot of books on tape that are fiction, and usually those are some W.B. Griffin, Tom Clancy, and there's a number of others out there that I'm waiting for them to come out on Audible again so I can get the new one and stuff. And so,
nice.
And that takes your mind away from what you've been doing for the last 10, 12 hours to what you're going to be doing when you get home, and kind of not dealing with all the crazy traffic.
I love reading. I can read fiction, nonfiction all day. It doesn't matter to me. So of those of your fiction authors, what's the series that you've been reading recently that's captured you?
Oh man, you're calling names right now.
I'll give you one. So I've been really into Jack Carr. Vince Flynn was I really love Vince Flynn and the Mitch Rapp character.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jack Carr brings something similar in the James Reese character.
Yeah. There's that whole host of authors. I've read all their series or listened to all their series on, and there's Mark Cameron doing some great work and stuff. So now I'm waiting for their new editions to be coming out later this year. So,
what's one of the nonfiction books you're reading right now?
Right now I am reading Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed and The Fifth Discipline by Peter Singe. And those are 2 right now that I think are taking most of my time up. Ron Wallace was the CEO of UPS. He started as a driver. It's a very quick read. I picked it up a couple weeks ago, and you can read it in 2 or 3 afternoons. So.
All right. Well, Dwayne, thank you very much for being here. Thanks for spending some of your valuable time with us here on the Coptimizer Podcast. And until the next time, I'm 1042.